Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Please take your seats. My name is Jenna Burbridge, and I'm a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. The Council is an independent and non-partisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. The event is on the record, we are live streaming, and we welcome your social media engagement. Later, we will be taking audience questions from the room and online at chi.cnf.io. Finally, before I turn it over to our speakers, a few brief words of introduction. Jake Sullivan is a Senior Fellow of Geoeconomics and Strategy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a Martin R. Flung Visiting Lecturer in Law at Yale Law School. Previously, he served as the Director of Policy Planning in the US Department of State and in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. He also served as Deputy Chiefs of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Senior Policy Advisor on Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Tom Weiler is the Senior Vice President for Global Strategy at PSP Capital Partners. He previously served as counselor to Secretary Penny Pritzker and as a Senior Advisor for International Economics at the US Department of Commerce. He is currently a non-resident fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Woodhouse and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I will be back to moderate audience Q&A, but for now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thank you, Jake, for being here tonight. I think this is a great venue. I think you will find tonight when we get to the question and answer period that you've probably got a pretty lively audience who has a lot of questions for you. There's obviously a huge amount going on in the world right now, so we have a lot to unpack, and you're here to explain it to everybody tonight. It was interesting. I will just say that I have a newfound respect for reporters because I was preparing for this last week on a flight from the West Coast back to the East Coast, back to Washington. And in the time from when I took off to when we landed, we had pulled out of the JCPOA, and North Korea had gone from being a rogue state to our partner in peace. So it's very hard to sort of keep up with what's happening. But maybe we can start with Iran. And obviously there's a lot going on in the news with Iran. What some people here may not know actually is about your role early on in sort of starting the Iran negotiation process. When you were at the State Department, I guess 2010, I think it was, you were part of the delegation that started the negotiations with the Iranians. It was really the first time that the US government had talked to the Iranian government at an official level in basically 30 years. Tell us about that experience and how did that start? How did that come to be?
Sure. So it was actually 2012. We had spent much of the first term of the Obama administration building a global coalition of sanctions, getting the whole world on board with us, which is sort of the opposite approach of what we're watching right now from the Trump administration, essentially to try to sharpen the choice for the Iranians, to make it clear to them that they either were going to face door number one, which would be unrelenting economic pressure, or door number two was an opportunity to come to the table, to negotiate in good faith, and to arrive at a mutually agreeable solution to their nuclear program. And so President Obama and Secretary Clinton asked myself and one other person to fly to the Gulf country of Oman in the summer of 2012 for a secret meeting with a group of Iranian officials to test whether or not we could open a private channel between the United States and Iran, direct bilateral talks, which, as you say, would be the first time the US and Iran would sit down together one-on-one since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. We'd been in larger formats with them, but never sitting across the table negotiating as counterparts. And when we arrived for the first meeting, there were sort of two notable elements to it. The first is the Iranians were instructed not to shake our hands. That was sort of where things stood. We went up to try and shake their hands. They put their hands on their chests. which at first I thought was, some kind of sign of friendship, and then they told me, no, in fact, just so you're clear, that's not a sign of friendship. That's us showing you we're not shaking your hands. And the second was that this was not yet Rouhani and Zarif. This was under the Ahmadinejad regime that we had our first set of conversations with them. And even so, all of the histrionics and the sort of litany of charges about the very checkered history between the US and Iran, that got checked at the door. And right away, we started talking about whether or not it'd be possible to think about a framework agreement that could ultimately resolve the Iranian nuclear program. And I'll just tell one more anecdote, because in this moment, now that the JCPOA is no more, I need to look for sort of humor and some sense of optimism where I can find it. Towards the end of the next session, when we went back in the summer, in the winter of 2013, because it took a while to really get this thing going, one of the guys came up to me, one of the Iranians, and he said, Mr. Sullivan, I've never been to America, but I understand that at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, there's a gigantic sign when you arrive that says, welcome to America, think the big. And that is what we have to do in these negotiations. We have to think the big. And so my wife, who was working for John McCain at the time and was not necessarily a huge fan of these negotiations, actually got T-shirts made for the negotiating team that said, think the big, which now that we need to figure out a new solution to the Iranian nuclear program, because the one that we had that was working as intended to keep Iran's nuclear program in a box, now we've got to think the big again.
So we'll get in a moment to sort of what's going on now and sort of the contemporary situation with the U.S. and Iran. But I do think it's actually important to set the context with what brought the Iranians to the table. Obviously, we've both mentioned that it had been 3 decades. Why were they there? Why did the Iranians want to come to the table? They were having some success with their program. They were moving towards, allegedly, a nuclear weapon. Why were they there? Because I think that context is important.
Right. Well, there's a couple pieces to this. The first is that when I went in the summer of 2012, Iran was 2 to 3 months away from having 1 weapons worth of weapons-grade uranium. And they were about a year to 18 months away from having a plutonium reactor online that itself would become a kind of bomb factory. It could produce 1 to 2 bombs per year of weapons-grade plutonium. And once turned on, it would be sort of impregnable to attack because the consequences of hitting a live nuclear reactor are so severe. So you're absolutely right. The clock was ticking, and it was ticking fast. Now, we had our own clock going as well, which was the clock of increasing pressure on Iran. And in 2010 and 2011, bipartisan majorities in Congress passed significant pieces of legislation that involved much more dramatic sanctions than we had used before. And Hillary Clinton and several other senior cabinet members fanned out across the world to basically build this global coalition, because the United States has not traded with Iran since 1979. So the brunt of the sanctions have to be borne by our partners. They're not borne by us, which meant getting the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Indians and the South Africans and the Europeans all to say, okay, we'll come along with you. And what we were able to do is reduce Iran's oil exports from 2.5 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day, basically in the span of about a year. And to freeze abroad somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion worth of Iranian assets that they couldn't use to advance their economy or any aspects of their policy. And so really, and this had a major impact on the politics of Iran as well. Rouhani was elected in part because people were sick of Ahmadinejad offending the world and bringing these sanctions on them. And they wanted relief. And Rouhani came and basically said, okay, let's talk, let's figure out a way where we can have our interests protected, but you can be satisfied that you have sufficient constraints and verification that we can't get to a bomb. And that's what led to the talks, which ultimately led to the deal.
So, one of the primary criticisms, and I think a sincere and serious criticism, is exactly sort of gets to the point you just made, is that the coalition, effectively, had its foot on the throat of the Iranian economy. Iran is clearly engaged in destabilizing behavior, was then, they are now in the region. They're a bad actor. And so there was an opportunity there to really change behavior of Iran broadly. Obviously, the deal did not do that. The deal was narrowly tailored, and it ignored a lot of their other bad behavior, which I think is one of the criticisms of Iran, of the deal, rather. So why is it wrong to argue that the administration took its foot off the throat of the Iranian regime prematurely? Why is that not a legitimate criticism?
You know, it's interesting. Over the years, particularly when we were in the heart of doing the deal, I was losing a tremendous amount of sleep because I kept asking myself that very question. Are we doing this right? Should we just be pushing them harder? You know, should we just be demanding more, and if they don't give us more, then just more sanctions, and on and on and on? Because there's no scientific formula you can pull out and say, okay, you know, now we know we got the best possible deal we could get. And one of the things that drove me to distraction after first the interim deal was announced and then the full deal was announced is people like Prime Minister Netanyahu would come out and say, you should have gotten a better deal. You know, not this deal, a better deal. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, oh, a better deal, you know. If only we had thought of that. We only thought about this deal and a worse deal. It didn't even occur to us to try to get a better deal, you know. But jokes aside, diplomacy is the art of trying to harness imperfection. You have imperfect information, you're facing imperfect choices, you have to make trade-offs. These are human judgments, and you do the best you can. And from my perspective, we basically had to satisfy ourselves, be able to look ourselves in the mirror and the American people in the eye and say, this will stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, on the argument that says if you just squeeze them a little harder, it'll just all break, they'll just collapse. I think this is a very dangerous line of thinking, and it is the core line of thinking that has motivated the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the deal and to go back to sanctions now. Fundamentally, in the back of their minds, they're thinking regime change. And my problem with the regime change-oriented argument is A, it does not have a particularly good track record for the United States. B, it leads you to think always, well, just a little more and they'll break, a little more and they'll break. And that will cloud your judgment about how to actually do the best to protect American interests as we go forward. I'll just say two other things on this. The idea that this agreement gave Iran all of the money it needed to go become a negative actor in the region, I think is complete revisionist history for a couple of reasons. First, when you go around the world and ask countries to join you in sanctions, they naturally ask, why? Well, what for? What am I trying to accomplish? And what we said to them was to stop their nuclear program. And they said, okay, so if you actually get a good deal that stops their nuclear program, then you lift the sanctions. Is that right? And we said yes to the whole world. That was the deal. That was the deal as Congress understood it. That was the deal as our partners understood it. That was the deal as we understood it. And why was this? Why was Bibi Netanyahu standing with that cartoon bomb at the UN? Because this was the issue. Iran as a negative regional actor is one thing. A nuclear Iran as a negative regional actor is a whole other thing. So we went and did that. And the idea today is, well, hold on a sec. Really what you should have done is kept those sanctions on until you dealt not just with the nuclear program, but with everything. That is rewriting the history of the sanctions. It's rewriting the history of what was possible. And the last thing I will say is nothing in the nuclear deal precludes the United States, or any of our partners for that matter, from taking measures to push back against Iran's malign activities in the region. We reserve the right to use economic pressure and other forms of pressure to push back on them. And indeed, the Europeans, in the weeks leading up to Trump's recent decision, were saying, let's keep the deal and then work on the rest of this together. And the Trump administration wasn't interested. They are using, I think, this argument about regional behavior and so forth more as an excuse to get out of the deal than as a serious good faith argument about why the deal was a bad idea.
So, okay, I think that's, obviously I think that's great context for everybody about what happened then. Fast forward to today, and last week for that matter, we've got a situation now where obviously our allies who had been with us, you mentioned how Secretary Clinton and President Obama had gone around the world essentially buttonholing allies, trying to get them to sign up for the sanctions regime that we put in place. Can that happen again? Because otherwise, you know, you sort of are with a situation where what's next, right?
Right.
So we're back in a situation that we were in for 30 years where the U.S. isn't trading with them. Our business community is being hurt.
Yeah.
But that's a sanctions regime that resembles Swiss cheese.
Yeah.
So what's next?
So it's interesting. The most effective sanctions, which, other people in this room, like Secretary Pritzker, know better than I do from having gone out and helped develop and enforce these strategies, involve a mix of coercion and cooperation. The coercion is that we hold the hammer out and say to the rest of the world, you got to come along with us. But the cooperation is that we say, let's work with you to figure out how we can do this in a way that's effective for the strategy, but also that isn't completely disruptive for you. That's the most. The cooperation aspect of this has been put up on the shelf. The Trump administration is making a bet that they can go to every country in the world and say, you either trade with us or with Iran, our way or the highway. I would say that for the European firms and banks, this is likely to work at least for a while, because they'll just look at their lawyers will look at them, and they'll say, it's not worth it. It's too risky for us to trade with Iran right now. But here's the problem. First, some of the other major oil purchasers like China, they'll come up with ways to insulate some of their businesses from the US threat and continue to trade. And so it will be a much weaker, leakier sanctions regime. But two, and more importantly, over the long term, the sanctions tool of the United States rests on other countries having some sense that we're acting in good faith. And I think Europe is going to go back and say, okay, we can't get our firms to trade with Iran this month because of the threat of US sanctions, but we've got to figure out a long-term strategy so we don't end up in this position again. And that means more insulation of their trading relationships from the US economy and the US financial system, more efforts to make the US sanctions tool writ large a weaker, less global tool. And I think that's taking an incredibly important asset the United States has and turning it into a wasting asset.
Yeah, we saw a lot of this, Secretary Pritzker and I and our team in the second term, with respect to a different country and a different foreign policy situation, is there is a lot of pushback on the U.S. sanctions power, and so it's an important time to be thinking about how we use it, and there are, I think, legitimate concerns about where that goes. But okay, so the agreement is still there. So the United States has withdrawn, Iran has not, Europe has not, other partners have not. There's this sort of limbo for the agreement. What do you see happening next? Where does this go from here?
So the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has been on a magical mystery tour of the other world powers who negotiated this agreement. Because keep in mind, when we pulled out of this, we weren't just pulling out of a deal with Iran. We were pulling out of a deal with the significant powers of the world, including our closest allies in Europe. So he was in Beijing, he's going to Moscow, and then he's going to Europe. And his message to the rest of the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, is if you can keep giving us the benefits, we'll stay in the deal. But I think it's going to be hard for Iran to continue to see those benefits because of the dynamic I just described. They'll see some from certain actors, but I think Europe is not going to be able to give him the satisfaction he needs. So then where are we? Well, it's hard to answer that question with respect to US policy, because now that Donald Trump has done his part of it, which is get rid of this perfidious Barack Obama awful deal, a deal, by the way, that he called the worst deal in human history, which, if true, is quite a remarkable feat, because there have been a lot of deals in human history. And if this is truly the worst one ever, when the Republicans were attacking the deal on the campaign trail in 2016, my mom called me up and was like, Jake, are they right? Like, did you do a really, really bad job on this thing, or what?
Wow, your mom, not a lot of confidence
She's
in
just
you.
like, I don't
After
know.
all these years.
It's a lot of people making this argument. It's like, stop watching the debates, please. So Trump has done his part. He's done. What comes next for him is kind of irrelevant, because for him, tearing down the deal was the beginning and the end of the Trump aspect of this. But the Trump team I think basically if you push them and you say, what is the point now of reimposing sanctions? What's the point? They won't give you a straight answer, but the point really is the pressure itself. Pressure is the strategy. Sanctions are the strategy. They want to use the means of sanctions to achieve the end of Iran being under sanction. And in an ideal world, as I said before, they hope maybe that will lead to the crack up and collapse of this regime. But even if not, it'll weaken and destabilize them. But even if not, it's a good thing to just have Iran in a sanctions penalty box. So they're happy to go forward with that for basically as far as the eye can see. Now, the Iranians are going to want to get some leverage back, and they're going to want to show their people that they haven't just been knocked down and couldn't get back up. So they will move their program forward. But I think they'll do it in a fairly cautious way because they don't want to make the rest of the world turn on them again. They want to keep the blame game kind of pointed at Washington rather than Tehran, and they don't want to invite military action in the near term. But 1 year from today, I anticipate the Iranian nuclear program will be further advanced and they will be closer to a bomb than they are today. And we will also be closer to military confrontation with Iran a year from now than we are today for that same reason. And you know, for something that was doing its job, working as it was intended, to get into that circumstance is, you know, is quite vexing for to watch from the sidelines.
Well, I think that's a fair point. And I would also agree. I mean, all the emphasis now, and this is what I think is disconcerting. All the emphasis is on the U.S. government's action,
Right.
And all the emphasis has been moved away,
Right.
from the Iranian regime's bad activity throughout the region. I mean, nobody's focused on that now. Everybody's sort of switched gears, and that's a strange place for us to be in.
Indeed.
Yeah. So if we could move to a different part of the world, a different rogue state and nuclear threat, and focus on North Korea for a moment. Obviously, also been in the news a lot lately, and it's interesting because there's been so much, for lack of a better way to put it, I guess, progress. It was less than a year ago that North Korea had its last nuclear test. A year ago, we were seeing tweets about Little Rocket Man and whose nuclear button was bigger, and all those things were sort of lighting up the newspaper every day. And now we're getting close to maybe a summit in Singapore between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. Obviously, today's news, maybe there's a setback for the summit. I'd be curious to get your view on whether or not you think the summit is going to happen. But more importantly, what's changed? What happened between last September and that last nuclear test and today when we've seen this progress? What has changed?
You know, it's funny. I sort of, just that question, it makes me remember I've been kicking myself for the last few months about this because last year I kind of fell into the same trap I think a lot of people did, which was, oh my God, we're headed to war. This is gonna, we're gonna end up in conflict, and I really thought that was distinctly possible. But I did so because I was focused too much on Donald Trump and not focused enough on Kim Jong-un. It's always a good thing when you're assessing a foreign policy situation, not just to look at the American perspective of it, but look at the other guy as well. And in this case, in a way, the answer to your question is nothing has changed. Kim Jong-un is executing a strategy that he had in mind going back some considerable period of time. What was that strategy? It was to race to what he defined as the finish line, which was to be able to do enough nuclear tests to be able to say to his people and the world, I've got the bomb, and I can miniaturize the bomb. And then to do enough ICBM tests to say, I also can fire a missile far enough to hit the United States. And in November of last year, he went out and he announced to his people, we've done it. We've achieved it. We've achieved both of those things. We've made enough progress on the bomb and enough progress on the missile program that now we can turn around and start pursuing the other pillar of my strategy, which is economic development and the rejuvenation of the great North Korean nation in the world. And so, sharp turn, heading into the Olympics and then the outreach to South Korea and ultimately to the United States. And when Kim does things like shut down his nuclear test site, he does so from a position of strength because he says, why do I need that anymore? I'm done testing. The U.S. hasn't tested a nuclear bomb in decades, but no one doubts we've got the capability and all the rest of it, and that's where I am too. Similarly, I don't need to fire any more ICBMs because I'm done with that testing as well. Now, there's an interesting gap right now between the US intelligence assessment, which is that he hasn't crossed the line. He hasn't proven the ICBM capability, and the Kim Jong-un intelligence assessment, which is that he has. That makes a pause valuable to both, a long-term extended freeze on testing. It's valuable to him because he can say, I didn't give anything up in that because I'm already there, and it's valuable to us because we can say he hasn't gotten there yet, so we've stopped him. So in a way, the circumstances are propitious for that deal, okay, for a deal that's a freeze. But what about the whole Donald Trump, I'm going to go get all of their nukes and missiles, and then in exchange we'll have peace and we'll pull our troops off the peninsula, and then the United States will be in the forefront of helping North Korea's economy, which is essentially the mood music and message coming out of Mike Pompeo's recent trip. I think you are likely to see, first of all, I think the summit will happen. There was news today that North Korea has put its diplomacy with the South on pause and has raised questions about whether it will go through with the summit because of ongoing US-South Korea military exercises. But I expect this is going to be part of the shadow boxing in the run-up. It will not actually derail the summit. And I think at that summit, they will write on a piece of paper, probably not longer than this, I, Kim Jong-un, will give up all my nukes, and I, Donald Trump, will do everything I said I was going to do, and we're going to have peace in our time. Short, sweet, definitive, grand bargain. And then Donald Trump's going to come home and say, I did it. All the losers and hazers couldn't get it done. I got it done. And I think that situation, in a way, will persist for quite some time, where there will be implementation or further talks that don't actually lead to the nukes leaving North Korea. But in the meantime, Donald Trump will essentially have said, situation solved, now it's just working out the details. And I think that is if I had to predict, I think that is where we are headed. And is that a bad thing? In a way, it's not a bad thing because A, it's better than war, and B, if it's accompanied by this freeze, if actually they're not continuing provocative testing and actions, then that's a legitimate win in its own right. However, if Trump ends up giving up too much too soon, then it is handing away all of our leverage to really not get in return what we would want. So I think it's responsible for all of us to just be sober and serious about asking the basic question, which is, okay, if this is a deal about getting rid of North Korea's nukes, where are the nukes? Have they been gotten rid of or not? And I think as long as we're focused on that metric, we can actually see what kind of progress is happening here.
Fair enough, but there's obviously a logical nexus here between what's going on in North Korea and what just happened in Iran. And so if you're Kim Jong-un and your description is basically of a pretty shrewd character, why actually give up anything when putting Trump aside for a moment, when the next US president could completely walk away from whatever comes out on this piece of paper, just like Trump just did in Iran? Well, so how far is Kim Jong-un going to be willing to go other than saying nice things and waiting to see whether or not this is a commitment that is only on a piece of paper?
Yeah. Well, first of all, North Korea has experience with this before. The Clinton administration did the agreed framework. The Bush administration walked away. They also have the experience of Iraq and Libya and so forth. One more reminder or data point from their perspective that the U.S. may be an inconstant negotiating partner, I don't think is going to be really definitive in Kim Jong-un's thinking. Point one. Point two, Kim's play here is not actually to surrender all of his cards to Donald Trump. It is to create a process that leads to an economic opening with China and South Korea, which we're already seeing, even without the formal removal of sanctions. And so for that, he doesn't actually need any guarantees that the US is going to do anything. So in a way, the Iran deal for Kim, I don't think looms particularly large in his thinking. What's interesting is when you ask Trump folks, well, this very question, they will say, actually, this is going to help us immensely with Kim because it shows we don't settle for bad deals. So it's going to help our negotiating leverage. I find that to be a kind of ridiculous argument. But I don't fully subscribe to the other argument, which is this means that there will be no deal between the US and North Korea. I think there will be a deal, but it will be a deal that just assumes American bad faith and is predicated on a certain kind of North Korean bad faith, but one that suits both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, that their interests converge around this strategy playing out roughly in the way that I just described.
Which is, I think it'll make it incumbent upon all of us who pay attention to this to look very closely at those metrics and to see whether or not real progress is being made. Can we change gears to talk about China for a moment? Again, another subject, another country that's in the news a lot right now. There's a huge amount going on. We were in China in December together with Secretary Pritzker and the two of us, and we had a little bit of time to compare notes. It seemed to all of us that the Chinese leadership, rightly or wrongly, but the Chinese leadership was of the view that they had basically sort of taken the measure of Donald Trump over the course of a year, that they had assessed that they could figure out how to work with him and how to manage him. He was a bit of a paper tiger, and they could flatter him and deal with the noise. Now, obviously, a lot's happened since December. Depending on the day that you look at the paper, we might be on the verge of a trade war, we may not. Do you think the Chinese leadership underestimated his resolve to deal with the trade deficit? Do you think they misunderstood him?
No, I don't think they underestimated his resolve on the trade deficit. In fact, I think they're prepared to do a deal on the trade deficit. In a way, the cri de coeur of the Chinese right now is tell us what you want. Just tell us what you want so we can figure out how to do something about it. What they underestimated was the dramatic division within the Trump economic team that has emerged, so that the Trump team may not be able to take yes for an answer. Because basically, the Chinese are more or less prepared to hand Trump a fairly significant victory significant political victory on the trade deficit and figure out a way to get the number down so that Trump can take credit for that. They'd love nothing more than to do that as kind of the global settlement of the U.S.-China trade dispute. But Peter Navarro and Bob Lighthizer regard that as a complete sellout, because their view is something much more fundamental about the Chinese economic model and the role of the state in their technology sector. And they want to go straight at the heart of that. And they're not going to be satisfied just with the deal on the trade deficit. So the American negotiating position leaked from the trip to Beijing a few days ago. And it's a rather remarkable read for those of you who haven't read it. The only thing that was missing, as one of my colleagues said, was at the bottom a line that said, if you don't agree, we will take your capital and burn it to the ground. It's had this kind of very 19th century quality of just like submit or be burned out of your homes. And that, I think, really shook the Chinese up, because they did not expect there to be such a systemic assault. They thought that this could just be dealt with through a bit of give and take on, auto restrictions here and some LNG purchases there and the like, and that's not what's happened. So the real question is, many of you will have seen the tweet Trump did on ZTE, the Chinese technology company, where he said, hey, I can't imagine, Secretary, what you would have felt like if President Obama had tweeted at you to go fix, a clear foreign scofflaws enforcement action. But that's what he did on ZTE, and it's confounding. But it suggests to me that the Chinese are essentially matching the American escalation with escalation of their own and trying to bring this issue to a head and get it resolved in a way where, Trump gets some things, the Chinese get some things, and this gets set aside. But the possibility that that doesn't happen, that the Trump team keeps thinking they can just get more and more and more, could lead us down a very dangerous path. And I think the Chinese are getting ready for that kind of plan B as well. So these coming weeks, I think, are incredibly important for how this all plays out.
So a lot of these issues that you just described, obviously you made reference to one in particular, were things that we dealt with in the Obama era. Martin Wolf wrote a piece in the FT today that, for those who haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's provocative. I don't know if you've seen it. It was just today. But basically the point is that how the West deals with its relative decline vis-a-vis China is sort of the greatest strategic question of our time. That's not a new question. We wrestled with that when it came to China ourselves. I guess, to be direct, Do you think that we underestimated, or at least just didn't manage the strategic challenge posed by China well?
You know, it's interesting. It's clear that we made 3 bets that have not paid out. We made a bet that bringing China into the global economy would make them more of a rule-following actor within the open international economy. That has not really played out. They've maintained their own model and system. They've been a free rider and selective stakeholder, kind of taken advantage of the system more than paid into it. We made a bet that trying to bring China into some of the larger regional security and political organizations would end up tempering Chinese desire for regional hegemony, that as they got stronger, they'd get more comfortable and less desirous of more ambitious regional ends. That has not really played out. As they've gotten stronger and more prosperous, they have said, you know, in a sense, what they've said is, why don't you guys stay on your side of the Pacific and we'll stay on ours, to the United States. And then the third bet was that as their economic system modernized and to a certain extent liberalized, their political system would too. If you go back and read Bill Clinton in the 1990s, or any Republican for that matter, it was an article of faith that, like almost the laws of physics, would move the Chinese political model in a more liberal direction the way its economic models are. Okay, all 3 of those bets were wrong, but I will suggest this. I don't think we were wrong to make any of those bets in a way. I mean, which is to say, if we had instead in 1991, at the apex of American power after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, had said, you know what, we think China's going to be a really dangerous, problematic actor, so starting today, we're just going to try and keep them down. I think you would be guaranteed a really negative outcome from that. We tried for a not entirely fuzzy-headed, but fairly consistent across administration's effort to manage China's rise in a way that welcomed them into the international order we had created, with some adjustments and modifications to take account of their growing power. In the end, it may just be it is too difficult to pull that off without a considerable amount of friction, and that we are going to have to keep the cooperative side, but increase the level of our competitive engagement with them. But in a funny way, it's like, yes, we got some things wrong, but if I went back and were doing the thrust of policy, I'm not sure I would have chosen a dramatically different course for that policy than the one that we chose. But we have to decide where we are today and now say, okay, we don't want World War III with China. We don't want Cold War containment. We don't want to just cede the field. So let's figure out a healthy mix of competition and cooperation that can work for us, work for them, and work for everybody else in the world. I think we are capable of doing that. I don't think Donald Trump necessarily is, but I think the United States over the coming decades is capable of doing that.
So I want to just take one moment, and not that I want to rehash 2016, but take one moment of interviewer privilege on something that is, I think, important, and ask you then about TPP and the decision, obviously, that you were Secretary Clinton's senior policy advisor. At some point, I can't remember exactly the date, but call it spring or summer of 2016, when she announced that she was no longer a supporter of TPP. That obviously, I can tell you, did not help the effort to get it through. So take us a little bit into the room when that decision was made, and sort of what was some of the thinking, given what you just laid out vis-a-vis China?
Yeah. So the big difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on TPP is that Hillary deeply believes we need a multilateral trade architecture for Asia that helps set the rules and raise the standards as a means of dealing with the Chinese economic challenge. Donald Trump believes we should only do bilateral deals with countries, one-offs, and this whole idea of multilateral trade architecture and rules to him is just a whole lot of bunk. So that's a huge difference. So I think what Hillary would have wanted to do if she had been elected was say, okay, TPP doesn't quite meet the standards in terms of US incomes, wages, jobs, et cetera, but we've got to come up with something that will. And she would have had an aggressive effort in her first year to figure that out. Her ultimate conclusion on TPP basically came down to the fact that she felt acutely over the time that she spent out on the campaign trail that with rising income inequality, stagnant wages, underemployment, massive underemployment, and no real, because the Republicans were blocking all of President Obama's efforts, investment in the American people in the preceding years, that to go look them in the eye and say, we've got the economic solution for you, and it's TPP, as opposed to TPP being part of a package of things on infrastructure, on minimum wage, on training, et cetera. I think from her perspective, it was just too hard to look people in the eye and say, yeah, let's move this through now or as a first act when I'm president. But she was acutely aware of the strategic cost of not having something like a TPP, and she would have aggressively pushed for a different TPP, but something that would have filled its place to help solve this problem.
You are a very talented debater, so I don't relish this prospect. I suspect that you and I will be debating the tactics of how that played out for many years to come.
Yeah.
So last question, then I want to open it up to a bunch of audience questions because I'm sure there's many. But so just tell us real quickly, what has Trump gotten right? Obviously, depending on who you ask, there's obviously NAFTA negotiations are ongoing. They don't look great as of today. There's this progress in North Korea, potentially some sort of agreement that comes out of China. What has he gotten right? What has he gotten right?
I've thought a lot about this. I thought a lot about it on the campaign trail, actually. And I think about it more and more because it's not the received wisdom in DC, but it's certainly receivable wisdom at this point, that Trump is doing a great job in foreign policy. David Brooks just wrote a column a few days ago essentially making this point, and I think we're going to hear more of this as we head into the summit and the like. So just a few thoughts. The first is, those of us who work on foreign policy have worked on foreign policy and national security in DC. I do think that we got a little bit fat and happy in our assumptions and the way we thought about things. And that's in part because there was basically a bipartisan consensus on the basic elements of American foreign policy. And so we never really had to rigorously test them. Now, I wouldn't call Trump a guy who's rigorously testing them. But sometimes throwing a stink bomb into the middle makes you all have to jump up and look around and check your pockets. And, in a way, I think that has been a productive thing for us to have to look at. I was on the campaign trail in 2016, and I made the mistake at an event in Ohio of using this phrase, the liberal international order, and which I use a lot because that's what we say in foreign policy. And a guy came up to me afterwards, and he said, I don't know what that is, the liberal international order, but I don't like any of those three words. So I thought, okay, let me give that some thought and figure out. So, but I would say the challenge that Trump has put to us, which I don't have an answer for yet, but I think everybody should be thinking hard about, is as the relative power of the United States, economic and otherwise, declines vis-a-vis other countries on the international stage, do we need to start thinking in more competitive terms? Do we need to say we got to push harder on deals than we did before? It used to be that we could absorb a lot of the costs of leadership because A, we had a certain cushion for it, B, nobody else really had the wherewithal to step up in the same way. But now, do we need to maintain Trump has a very zero-sum mindset, which I completely reject. I think we have to think in positive-sum terms about how we're better, safer, and stronger when others are better, safer, and stronger. But does that have to come with a little bit more of a competitive edge? I think it's a reasonable question. Now, there are ways to do that that are not bullying and browbeating and throwing your allies under the bus. But for me, it's something I'm struggling with as I think things through. And then the other big thing that I'm struggling with is how does what America does over there connect back to the lived experience of Americans at home? And I will tell you that around the Situation Room table, we did not frequently ask that question. Because national security dealt with national security, the domestic economic folks dealt with it. And in a way, you guys in commerce were in both conversations, It was like you're in the national security conversations with we national security types, and we didn't really put these conversations together and say, how do we have an integrated, unified, grand strategy for our country that's fundamentally about putting American working people, middle class, front and center, and what would that actually look like? Again, this is not something Trump has articulated in any kind of useful or linear way, but from Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right, you have a kind of elemental critique that has to be considered and taken seriously, and I'm trying to do that as well.
Well, you and I are working on this task force together, and I think you, frankly, just summed up what we're trying to accomplish very well, better than we've been able to do in basically a year of trying to do this. So, and I also know that our former Secretary of Commerce is thinking about these issues all the time. So maybe with that, we can turn it over to the audience and
thank you to our speakers. We have some time now. Yep. So we have some time now for some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Wait for me to call on you. Speak into the mic. And of course, make sure your question is a question. Right. So the gentleman in the first row there.
We're talking about U.S. global engagement, and you've got all the headline issues, right? But when you were in government, you were dealing with below the headline issues. I dealt with you when you went to Cyprus and moved that.
Yeah.
Stephen Cook wrote a great piece in Foreign Policy today about crises, maybe in the Aegean and Bosnia, in the Red Sea, that we don't know if anybody is paying attention to. Maybe you have an opinion. Is anybody paying attention to those, or what are the things below the headline that we should be paying attention to that really challenge U.S. global engagement?
Yeah. I'll identify three things that worry me that many people in this room may be familiar with, but are not getting the attention they deserve. But before I do, just on the point, I think Rex Tillerson did untold damage to, not just to the State Department as an institution, but to civilian power in the United States government, our diplomatic and development professionals, and their immense capacity behind the scenes in thankless ways to help address and manage some of the very kinds of crises that you've just described. He drove out senior diplomats by the dozens. He discouraged more junior enterprising people from deciding to stick around and rise through the ranks. He held money back that would otherwise be spent on certain types of diplomatic efforts along the lines you described. What's interesting is Mike Pompeo announced today that he's lifting the hiring freeze at the State Department. He also announced 2 assistant secretary and an undersecretary position, and is trying to signal, I have a lot of quarrels with Mike Pompeo on policy, but what he's doing with respect to trying to rebuild civilian power and the State Department, I think could help us get back to a place where we're paying more attention to some of those things. Today, do I believe anyone's at home thinking about the Western Balkans or the Aegean or the Red Sea? I do not. I do not think that we have a serious effort even to have a good sense of what's happening, let alone to be trying to be an effective partner and helping shape outcomes there. So some of the things that I'm worried about. First, John Bolton has just eliminating the position of cybersecurity director at the NSC. And I think it reflects, for Bolton, cyber is not really as interesting to him as, gearing up to maybe fight Iran at some point, or lie in the weeds and wait for North Korea diplomacy to break down. But I do not think the United States government right now has the interconnections with itself, let alone with the private sector, that are required to protect this country, or to build a global conversation around how we get a set of rules and norms in place so that we don't see these cyber conflicts escalate and spin out of control. So that's one thing that I'm very worried about. The second thing that I just can't figure out if the Trump administration is paying any attention to is that we do have 2 nuclear-armed states in India and Pakistan facing off against each other still over Kashmir. And if there were another Mumbai-style attack in India, I think the possibility that turns into war is not small. And the possibility there is such a terrorist attack is not small. And yet, I think it's something that we just have not been putting sufficient time into thinking about. And then the final thing that I will say, and I know I will get in trouble with every Fox News commentator who's, if you use the words climate change in close proximity to national security, you're some kind of pointy-headed person who doesn't care about terrorism. But the ravages of climate and desertification across large swaths of sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region in particular, is creating a cycle of climate migration, deprivation, that's itself affecting all the way up to Northern Europe, but particularly in those regions, it's radicalization, it will be wars over resources, it will be massive refugee flows. The Europeans are thinking about this. The United States of America is not really thinking about it, and it is a slow-moving catastrophe of immense proportions that deserves, and a human catastrophe especially, leave aside the security implications and everything else. This is about millions of people suffering in a, just right before our eyes as we watch the direct impacts of climate change in that region harm so many and ultimately harm our security and economic interests as well. So those are some examples, but you know, when you're in government, you are captured to a certain extent by the tyranny of the inbox. It's like what's happening that day you have to deal with, and particularly for the United States, like it or not, we, you know, that inbox is global in scope. And so I think it is a great question because, you know, I like to think of Donald Trump, when a hurricane hits a city, people talk about building back better. You know, don't just rebuild the infrastructure, but come think about what was broken, build back better. I like to think, you know, after Hurricane Donald Trump, we can think about how to build back better in the State Department, across the U.S. national security decision-making apparatus. And one of the things we need to focus on is integrating economics and security, and another one is foresight and thinking about what we're not thinking about. So I thank you for your question.
Can I just add one point on that, is that while it's good in some of these issues that others are thinking about it, without the United States thinking about it, nobody's got the resources to really execute against the problem, particularly when it comes to climate change. With the United States not present at that table, it's good that people are thinking about it, but it isn't going to move forward in the way that we would demand or expect otherwise.
Great. Other questions? Yes, the gentleman on the sixth row.
Yes, on the Iran deal, to make it better, so to speak, did they think of maybe putting in some controls in there to ensure that the Iranians indeed spend this on infrastructure rather than on bad behavior somewhere in the Middle East, e.g., give them some kind of a gift certificate that goes by country, this much for the US, for France, et cetera. Maybe even throw in Israel in there, because Israel's very advanced in water technology, and Iran has a severe problem with water. And it would also improve relations. You hardly want to kill the guy who's trying to help you with your water. Did they ever think of something like that?
So the big challenge there was that money is fungible. So the releases, we talked about transparency of releases of funds from, keep in mind, by the way, a lot of people think we gave Iran $100 billion for, right, but just so that we're all talking about the same thing here. What we did was freeze Iran's money and then unfreeze it so they could get access to it. So you might say that we bought their nuclear compliance with their money. And so when we unlocked it, we talked about various transparency requirements for where it would go into the budgeting process and the like. But at the end of the day, if they took all that money and spent it on domestic needs, then the money that they were currently spending on domestic needs, they could move over and spend on terrorism, if that makes sense. Like, it's hard to police a complex state's budgeting process when you're only dealing with a portion of their overall resources. But I want to underscore something really important, which is the narrative that has developed that the deal gave them the money they needed to go be present in all these places in the region. Okay. So, first of all, I seem to recall heavy Iranian influence in Iraq in the period from 2003 to 2015 when the deal was signed. Iran on the ground in Syria for years before the deal ever went into place. Iran deepening its ties with Hezbollah and Hamas and other terrorist organizations across the Middle East years before the deal was a glint in anyone's eye, and so on down the line. Iran was a bad actor in the region before the deal. It was a bad actor in the region during the deal, and it will be a bad actor in the region after the deal. And the main constraint on Iran is not cash, it's opportunity. When they get an opportunity, they seize it. And more opportunities have opened up in a very messy region. More have opened up even with President Trump in office over the course of the past year. So I'm, it is always difficult to do an arms control deal with an adversary, with a country with whom you disagree so violently on so many things. But that is sometimes what the US has to do. And that's what we did with the Soviets, obviously, many times when we were still at loggerheads with them. And that's essentially what this was. This was an arms control agreement, not an effort to resolve the larger question of Iran's bad behavior.
Great. Alyssa, at the front row, please. Thank you.
I'm glad you just mentioned the US-Soviet arms control efforts, because my question actually flows from that. During the Cold War, delivery vehicles were a sort of intrinsic element of every arms control agreement we signed with the Soviet Union. Was the president ever presented with the option of including ballistic missiles, Iran's ballistic missiles, in the negotiation? And so did he sort of make a formal determination that he would not try to capture that and only focus on the elements of the nuclear program?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we spent the better part of 2 years trying to hold the world together and then hold Iran accountable for the inclusion of ballistic missiles in the deal. But at the end of the day, we had to make a judgment, because the Iranians basically said, we're not doing a deal that includes ballistic missiles, period, full stop. We consider that a part of our conventional regional capability. It's an inherent part of our self-defense. We won't do the deal. We won't do the deal. So we have a choice at that point. The president ultimately had a choice. Do you say, well, forget it. Unless we get the missiles, no deal. Or do you say, okay, we actually believe the only way to do this deal is if we have some things on missiles, and we continued with the UN sanctions on missiles, but not have them centrally involved in the agreement. And in a way, I think where the president's logic went on this is consistent with what you just said about the US-Soviet arms control agreements. Why were delivery vehicles central to those agreements? Because in a way, you can either get the nukes or you can get the missiles. We weren't getting the nukes from the Soviet Union. They were going to keep their nukes. So we got constraints on the missiles. In this case, the president's view was, if I can stop them from having the nukes in the first place, then those missiles could never carry a nuke. And from our perspective, that was better than nothing at all. But we absolutely vigorously tested the proposition of whether that they could be included, and I think the president ultimately concluded, even in their absence, it was worth doing this deal. But this is the kind of thing where you lie awake at night and you say, look, that's human judgment, right? Maybe somebody else go in there and make a better argument, or argue louder, or we go back to sanctions or whatever. But of the things I feel, you always think, oh, maybe I could have had that back, we could have tweaked this or tweaked that. I don't lose a lot of sleep over the idea that, if we had just pushed a little harder, they would have given us the missiles. I don't think they would have. And so the question is, do you want the nukes or nothing? And I think it was right to try and get the nukes.
We have time for just one more question, and I'm going to take it from Conferences IO because we've had a lot of questions come through here. If you could go back and change one foreign policy decision from the Obama administration, what would it be?
All right, I will say I don't know any longer where I stand on the Libya issue. I can't say fully I think it was a mistake. I have a lot of questions about it, but I'll put that aside for the moment. The thing that I'm confident if we had it to do over again, I'd want to do over is the way that we responded to the Iranian revolution, the Green Revolution in 2009. Now, just to be clear, the reason President Obama decided not to speak out about the Green Revolution was not because he was trying to get a nuclear deal or because he was trying to make nice with the Ayatollah. It's because he legitimately believed that the United States speaking out would undermine the cause of the demonstrators, not help them. He legitimately believed that. And so I don't buy all of this, you know, he was just selling out to the Ayatollah, not at all. But it's become clear to me over time that when you're faced with decisions like that, it's hard to judge, does it help, does it hurt, whatever. It's better just to stand on your principles and speak your principles. And so if we had to do over again, I would have advocated. I was an advocate for the position that we took at the time, which was a reticent, sort of a cautious position. I would have advocated that he go out and more aggressively rhetorically support the protesters.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. I would like to invite you to stay for our networking reception. The cash bar will be open. Our speakers will stay for a little bit of time too, so let's continue the conversation. Thank you.